Hey everyone, it's Professor Clark, and we are starting Chapter 8. Woohoo! And Chapter 8 doesn't appear at first glance to have as much info dumping as Chapter 7. Chapter 7 had a very impressive amount of info dumping. Chapter 8 is going to have fewer lectures, they're going to be shorter, it might seem in some ways simpler. That is wrong. What we're going to go over in Chapter 8 are verbs of motion. And you probably encountered verbs of motion in first year, and maybe you started to realize the true horror of the situation, maybe you didn't. But just as a quick recap, remember that Russian and Slavic verbs of motion are very different from the verbs of motion in most Western European languages. So we are going to spend chapters 8 and 9 going over verbs of motion and getting a short, simple, quick introduction to verbs of motion. It probably won't seem short, simple, and quick, but believe me, compared with what it could be, this is very short, simple, and quick. This is a brief introduction to verbs of motion. So in this lecture, we are going to go over the basic unprefixed verbs of motion. So what's so bad about Russian verbs of motion anyway? Well, as you may remember from first year, in Russian and in most other Slavic languages, verbs that indicate movement are in the special category called verbs of motion that have a special set of rules. And in these languages, in Russian and most other Slavic languages, you have to be more precise about the type of motion being indicated than in most Western European languages. So there's no word to go in Russian. There's no word to ride. There's no word to take or to bring. I mean, there are words that are sort of the equivalent of that, but there's no one word that just means to go or to drive or to ride or anything like that. In Russian, you have to be more precise about what kind of going you're doing. And on page 194 in your textbook, there are some charts that give you this handy overview of the basic Russian verbs of motion. So if you look on those charts on page 194, you will see that Russian has 8 pairs of basic verbs of motion. These are the base verbs, the base forms that form all of the other common verbs of motion in Russian. We're leaving out things like sitting and standing, which are also verbs of motion, but all of the various versions of to go or to drive or to take are these 8 pairs of basic verbs of motion. So you have a total of 16 verbs of motion, of these basic verbs of motion. All of these verbs are imperfective. So these are the basic imperfective forms of these verbs of motion. They can also all have perfective forms, which we will learn later. But right now, just remember that all 16 of these verbs are imperfective, and these are all versions of to go, to drive, or to take, as in when you're taking something from one place to another. And then within these 8 pairs of basic verbs of motion, Russian makes 3 distinctions. So unidirectional versus multidirectional motion. You always have to indicate whether your motion is just in one direction or whether you are moving in multiple directions or in circles. You also always have to indicate whether the motion is self-powered or you are being carried. This is often known as motion on foot versus motion not on foot. However, vehicles themselves often use these self-powered or on-foot verbs because they are powering themselves. And then finally, you have to make the distinction between intransitive versus transitive motion. So things like to go or to walk is intransitive. It does not normally take a direct object, versus to carry or to take in English is transitive. It takes a direct object. And so in Russian, we also make this distinction. And so we have intransitive and transitive verbs of motion. Let's start by discussing the first basic and potentially most important distinction, which is unidirectional versus multidirectional. This is the one that we do not make in English or most other Western European languages, and so it's the one that's most difficult to grasp for most American students. And so in Russian and most other Slavic languages, we have this concept of directionality that we just don't have in Western European languages. And so you always have to indicate when you are talking about going anywhere, whether the motion is unidirectional or if it is multidirectional or circular or aimless. And so some examples in English of unidirectional motion would be, I am going to the store, or I am going to class, I am going to New York, I am going to Russia. And in these, we show motion currently in progress towards a specific goal with no indication of return. Examples of multidirectional motion in English would be, I go to class every day. I often go to New York. Last summer, I went to Russia and came back. And in these, multidirectional, circular, or returning motion is indicated or implied. So if I go to class every day, and I don't have any more information in that sentence, that indicates that I go there and I come back and I go there and I come back and I go there and come back. The same with I often go to New York. I go there and I come back and I go there and I come back. This means that there has to be multidirectional motion. Or last summer I went to Russia and came back. That is also multidirectional motion because it's a round trip. So those are some examples of the types of motion that these verbs describe that we do not indicate in English, but we do indicate in Russian. On slide 5 of the PowerPoint, I have a chart of unidirectional versus multidirectional verbs with their conjugations. And this is sort of the most basic and most important division between these two verbs. And notice that we have matched pairs. So for each of these verbs, there's a matched pair. Идти, to go on foot unidirectionally, ходить, to go on foot multidirectionally, ехать, to go by vehicle unidirectionally, ездить, to go by vehicle multidirectionally, лететь, to fly unidirectionally, летать, to fly multidirectionally, плыть, to swim or sail unidirectionally, плавать, to swim or sail multidirectionally, бежать, to run unidirectionally, бегать, to run multidirectionally, везти, it's pronounced везти, but it's spelled везти, is to transport by vehicle unidirectionally, and возить, to transport by vehicle multidirectionally. Вести, it's spelled вести and pronounced вести, is to lead, guide, or drive unidirectionally. Водить, note that de in the conjugated form of вести appears in the multidirectional form водить, is to lead, guide, or drive multidirectionally. And нести is to carry on foot unidirectionally, and носить is to carry on foot multidirectionally. And again, note that I have the conjugations for these different verbs. Another big distinction that Russian verbs of motion have that most Western European verbs of motion don't have is that Russian makes this distinction between motion that is powered by the mover, these are often called foot verbs, and motion that shows the mover is being carried. These are often called vehicular or not on foot verbs. And these self-powered verbs of motion are used to denote motion such as walking, so I'm walking around, but also motion by vehicles themselves, especially large vehicles. So you can say я иду, I am going or I am walking, and поезд идет, the train is going. The vehicular or carrying verbs of motion, on the other hand, are used to denote motion in a vehicle, but they can also be used to denote motion by vehicles, especially small vehicles. So we can say, for instance, я еду на машине. I'm traveling by car, or I'm going in a car, or I'm driving. But машина едет. The car is going, or the car is driving. And again, when you're talking about vehicles, you can often use either the self-powered versus transport verbs of motion, but frequently the big vehicles like trains tend to use the self-powered verbs of motion like идти, and smaller vehicles like cars often use the transport vehicular motion verbs like ехать, as we see here. So on slide 7 of the PowerPoint, I have a chart showing the self-powered verbs versus the carrying or vehicular verbs. And some of them are only in one group. For example, идти, ходить is self-powered. Ехать, ездить is vehicular. Нести, носить, self-powered. Везти, возить, vehicular. Везти, водить, I have here as self-powered. It's also what you use to say that you're driving a car, but the more important thing there is that you're guiding or you're leading the thing, not whether or not you're in a vehicle. And then бежать, бегать, self-powered, of course, normally. And then note that лететь, летать, to fly, is in both, as is плыть, плавать, to swim or sail. So with those, we can say, for example, птица летит, the bird is flying. Самолет летит, the airplane is flying. But я лечу на самолете, I'm flying by airplane. So they can be used for any sort of flying, whether it's the actual thing or animal doing the flying, like a bird or a plane, or whether we're indicating a passenger flying on a flying object, like a passenger in an airplane. And the same for плыть, плавать. And then the third distinction that we have, which is the same as in English, so this should be easier to deal with, are intransitive versus transitive verbs. And so these intransitive verbs are the equivalent of to go, and they do not normally take a direct object, although sometimes you can have the distance that you travel as a direct object, but in general, they are intransitive and do not take a direct object. Versus the transitive verbs of motion, which mean things like to take, to carry, or to lead, guide, or drive, and they can and normally do take a direct object. And the final chart here on slide 9 of the PowerPoint is of these intransitive versus transitive verbs of motion. So the intransitive are идти, ходить, ехать, ездить, лететь, летать, плыть, плавать, and бежать, бегать, versus the transitive нести, носить, везти, водить, везти, возить. Remember, it's pronounced везти, but spelled везти, везти, возить. Let's look at some tips on usage. So there will be lots more tips on usage, but let's start with some really basic ones. So first of all, these foot motion verbs, so идти, ходить, should be used for motion within a city unless you're specifically mentioning a vehicle. So we could say, я хожу на занятия каждый день. I go to class every day. And maybe for part of the trip, you take the bus or you drive or something, but if you are indicating motion within the city limits, you want to use идти, ходить unless you are specifically mentioning the vehicle that you ride on. However, if you are describing motion between cities or countries, you should use these vehicular motion verbs like ехать, ездить. For instance, я часто езжу в Нью-Йорк. I often go to New York. And if you're traveling from, say, Winston-Salem, of course you're going to use a vehicle to go to New York. So you're going to use ехать, ездить, unless you did in fact walk to New York, in which case you would want to indicate that. If you are talking about flying motion, you can use either ехать, ездить or лететь, летать. So я ездил в Нью-Йорк means I went to New York and came back, and you could have driven or taken the train or flown. If you say я летал в Нью-Йорк, it means I flew to New York and came back. So ехать und ездить can be driving in a car, riding on a train, or taking a plane, whereas лететь, летать is just to fly. And finally, some tips on conjugation, because along with everything else, some of the verbs of motion have some tricky conjugations. And there is a chart on page 196 of your textbook that has a really useful exercise where you fill in the missing conjugations of these verbs of motion. And some tips. Note that all the unidirectional verbs of motion except лететь are first conjugation. And also note that a number of them have consonant mutations. So, for example, ехать, х goes to д, ехать, я еду. Вести, с goes to д, вести, веду. And then плыть conjugates like жить, so плыть, я плыву. And then бежать. Бежать is one of the 4 truly irregular verbs in Russian, and it's really pretty wacky. They have the full conjugation of it on page 194 of the textbook. And so you're just going to want to memorize that. And then of the multi-directional verbs of motion, ходить, ездить, носить, водить, and возить are second conjugation with consonant mutations. And then летать and плавать are first conjugation. And note that ходить, носить, водить, and возить all have stress shifts. So not only do they have consonant mutations, but they have stress shifts. This is a very common pattern in second conjugation verbs, and particularly these second conjugation verbs of motion. So there you go. I hope you found that helpful. It may have just seemed like a whole lot of information that didn't make any sense at all. Once again, your best bet, as always, is to read or watch TV, listen to the radio, but reading is especially helpful because you can do it slowly and make multiple passes over the same sentence. And there are lots of good exercises in the textbook that show you the different verbs of motion in context. So I suggest you start going through those and doing the readings, and hopefully it will start to begin to make sense.